Professor Tedder, I've just a handful of further questions. The first arises out of your study published in The Lancet, September 1984, and the finding that 63 out of 184, so 34%, of the haemophiliacs tested had the antibodies for HTLV3. Were those results provided to the haemophilia centres that had supplied the samples?
I would be devastated if they hadn't been.
So your expectation would
Oh,
be
absolutely, because, I mean, if we were referred samples from any clinical area for any serological testing, irrespective of what it was in the Department of Virology, if we generated results, those results are owned by the people who sent us the samples from their patients and indirectly owned by the patients.
And would you have expected those 63 haemophiliacs to have been informed of their results? Obviously not by you, but by their centres.
I would have anticipated, I would have hoped, but I don't know. I would have hoped they would have been, because that would have been a responsible thing to do, or no matter how difficult and appalling it is.
Next question on a different topic, hepatitis B. After the introduction of the first generation tests in 1972, what was your impression of the prevalence of hepatitis B over the following years in the 70s and 80s?
In objective terms, I can't give you a response to that. Low, but whether it was lower than predicted or higher than predicted, I don't know. It's not an area I was deeply involved with.
Then picking up on Dr. Dane's theme of know your donor and the importance of donor exclusion criteria, and obviously we discussed that yesterday, Professor Tedder, but from your perspective as a virologist, are you able to comment on what would be effective donor exclusion criteria for hepatitis B and for non-A, non-B hepatitis, hepatitis C?
Parental exposure to other people's blood, which would mean recreational drug use, prior history of transfusion receipt. Those are the two principal criteria. And obviously, having hepatitis, clinical hepatitis of any type, or known or suspected, would be another reason for excluding such an individual.
I asked you about your recollection of the test results for the Edinburgh cohort and the communication of that to Dr. Ludlam. In relation to testing of samples from Trelaws, so the school and the haemophilia centre there run by Dr. Arenstam, do you have any recollection of testing samples from Trelaws or of any communications with Dr. Arenstam about test results?
I'm afraid I do not.
And then, in relation to the evaluation process for the HIV screening, you referred to needing to have panels of known positives and known negatives. Do you know whether samples from people with haemophilia were used in the evaluation of tests?
No.
Last question is this. I don't know if you can answer this, but it is a matter I've been asked to raise with you, and it may be you can assist. Is it possible for a person who's achieved a sustained virological response to hepatitis C to have the virus reactivated following cancer treatment?
Are we talking about hepatitis B or
hepatitis C?
C.
Yes.
Is it possible to reactivate?
So if somebody has had has reported a sustained virological response and is effectively told they have cleared the virus, to have the virus reactivated following cancer treatment, is the question I'm asked to pose.
Well, if the sustained response equates to virus clearance from the liver, then that should not be possible. If, on the other hand, the sustained response is inducing a period of suppression of detectable viremia, and the assumption is made that the patient is then cured of the infection, that infection could re-establish it if you subject that host and that patient to immunosuppression. But it's like so many things. You can think you've got rid of a virus infection in a human host, and then you do something to them, and if there's any residual virus, it may reactivate. But on the whole, if you're saying somebody is cured, and the assumption and the belief is that there is no virus left, then it would not reactivate.
Thank you. So those are the questions I'm proposing to ask from those put forward, and I understand that Professor Tedder's representatives have no questions to request. Do you have any questions for Professor
Well, just one, really. It arises out of your discussion with Council this morning about the question of testing by a surrogate means. And let me approach it in this way. So far as hepatitis is concerned, so far as HIV is concerned before it was identified as HIV, the principal defense, as I understand it, was knowing your donor and excluding what you might call risky donors from the donor pool. Am I right?
I think that is a precept, know your donors, is true whether or not you have serological testing. So, yes, broadly.
And what that means is that you exclude people you identify as having a lifestyle which might give rise to infection. It might not. So if you're, for instance, asking men who have sex with men not to donate, you may be excluding, and probably are excluding, a majority of that group who don't have infection. It's because of the size of the potential size of the minority that you want to exclude any member of the group. Am I right about
Correct,
that?
Yes.
And that was done, and there appears to have been no violence done in the course of it to the blood donation service, the donation side of the blood transfusion service. No unsustainable violence anyway.
I'm sorry, I'm not entirely following that last question. Could you?
It was done without losing too many donors.
Well, yes, by definition, because it was a policy which was put in place to exclude a risk population, the same as we would exclude somebody who'd come from a malarial country. Within a certain time frame, you would not wish them to be a donor. You would not wish people who have a risk of acquiring certain infections through certain behaviors, and you can expand that as much as you wish. One would not want that particular individual or individuals to offer themselves as donors.
Now, when you were discussing testing by means of anti-HBC, you indicated that that might be a marker for or indicator of a risky lifestyle, because it may give rise to aspects of life which might put you into one of the high-risk groups for not donating.
Yes.
Your concern, as I understand it, about that test generally, was that it might exclude too many from donating.
Well, I think it depends on the population in which you're going to introduce anti-core testing. There are some countries where 15 to 20% of your population may be anti-core seropositive. And in that situation, to introduce that as a surrogate testing would be damaging.
But talking about the UK,
You could introduce anti-core screening.
And in fact, that would be doing no more than using a biological test to identify a yes tick in the box which says, yes, I have one of these lifestyles which might be risky, so I won't donate.
In a proportion of those, but equally well, a significant proportion from a donation point of view would be people who'd been brought up or emigrated from countries with a high prevalence of hepatitis B.
And people who were brought up in a country and came from a country with a high rate of whatever the disease was, say a country where an epidemic is raging, you might want to exclude those, might you, from your blood donation pool?
No, not necessarily, because you remember that the population in this country who you are collecting blood for is multiple phenotypes of people of different racial groups, each of which have a requirement for matching their blood group of the person from whom you're taking the blood with the blood group of the person who's receiving it. So if you start distorting the population, you might find it's very difficult to find a blood group match for somebody who's in an ethnic group where hepatitis B might be a common marker.
I see. So in those cases where you have a small proportion of the population, a rare blood group, if you want to call it that.
You might do some harm like that.
I mean,
again, it's all a question of balance, and I'm not sure quite where the benefit and loss, where you would put the appropriate benefit and loss in that.
Well, it's to establish in my own mind where that balance should properly have been drawn and where it is to be drawn that I've been asking those questions, and thank you very much for those answers.
So I should just say, I think Professor Tedder had referred a couple of times during his evidence to the current shortage of donors.
Yes.
And I have been asked to point out that, as I understand it from the news, and my knowledge is no more than what is set out in the news, that it's not a shortage of donors that had led to the Amber Alert being issued by NHSBT, but staff shortages. That is at least what is reported. And of course, reported that there has been an immediate response of multiple numbers of donors coming forward as a result of that Amber Alert.
We do not have to inquire into that
We do
particular
not.
situation, but there are mixed messages, perhaps, which are coming out. One of the interesting features may be, this is just a comment and it may be wrong for others to pick up, but the ease with which a large number of donations was obtained once the call went out. But that's for others to argue about in due course. Thank you very much.
Professor Tedder, is there anything that you would wish to add?
Well, I think yes. As a virologist, I'm sometimes seen to be just interested in virology and not much else, but I have a deep sadness for the harm, unexpected and unintentional harm, which has occurred through the allowing a virus to become loose in a population, and particularly the harm which has happened to people who, through well-meaning therapeutic invention from the health services, have actually become infected with HIV and other agents. And all I can say to those people, I feel desperately sad and desperately sympathetic to the well-being of those people who are harmed. And I'm just very sorry as a virologist that it brings me into a position to have to say an object of my interest, which is HIV, has caused so much damage to so many people and people in the room. You have my deepest sympathy, and all I can say is if another agent ever comes around like that, we will be very, very careful to limit its damage. I say that, and what have we got? We've got a coronavirus at the moment, and that's a slightly different issue. But again, we need to try and control the introduction of these agents into the human population.
Thank you. Sir.
It's often said, and maybe rightly, that it's never too late to learn. You have taught us, Professor Tedder, that as an inquiry, Perhaps we should have learned some time ago, but you've taught us now that for any expert witness, we might usefully have installed a whiteboard and a marker.
I think it's nice to use your hands and demonstrate shapes like this, but these are transient, and it's sometimes useful to have a whiteboard or a blackboard and actually be able to draw things out. That's assuming that the person behind the instrument is able to draw accurately and precisely. But it would be helpful, but not absolutely.
But I'd like to thank you for using words and hands to educate us in some of the subtle mysteries of viruses, their transmission, and their effects, and how they might be tested for. It's been very valuable, particularly since you were referred to so often in many of the documents we've been looking at in the rest of this inquiry. So thank you for coming as a scientist and exploring those mysteries of science with us. Thank you.
So that completes our evidence now until the 8th of November, and I can now set out what evidence we're going to hear when we return.
Well, let us do that, shall we? This is Tuesday, the 8th of November onwards.
Yes. So we will be hearing on the 8th of November from Brian Amani, Chief Executive of the Irish Haemophilia Society. On the 9th of November, we will be hearing the rearranged evidence of the statistical group. So that'll be Professor Sheila Bird, Professor Stephen Evans, and Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter. On the 10th of November, we will be hearing from Professor Ian Roberts, who is Professor of Epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and co-founder of the Joint College's Tranexamic Acid in Surgery Implementation Group. And that's to look at some particular issues about the use of tranexamic acid and minimising the need for blood transfusion. And we'll be hearing from Professor Derek Manus, Medical Director of the Organ and Tissue Donation and Transplantation Clinical Team at NHS Blood and Transplant. On the 11th of November, we will be hearing from Alex Chisholm, Chief Operating Officer for the Civil Service and Permanent Secretary for the Cabinet Office, in the morning of the 11th of November. In the afternoon of the 11th of November, we will be hearing evidence about the availability of specialist psychological support for those infected and affected. The witnesses will include Dr. Caroline Coffey from the Welsh Infected Blood Support Scheme, Dr. Belinda Hacking, Director of Psychology Services for Lothian and Chair of the Heads of Psychology Services across Scotland, and Caroline Leonard, Director of Cancer and Specialist Services at the Belfast Health and Social Care Trust. We anticipate there will be an additional witness or witnesses as part of that session, but those are the ones currently confirmed. Then in the second week, the 14th of November, on the Monday, we will hear from Andrew Goodall, the Welsh Government Permanent Secretary, and Leslie Fraser, Director General Corporate for the Scottish Government, in the morning. And in the afternoon, we will be calling Dame June Rain, Chief Executive of the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. On the 15th of November, we'll be hearing from Dr. Susan Hopkins, Chief Medical Advisor for the UK Health Security Agency, in the morning, that is. And in the afternoon, Professor Colin Melville, Medical Director and Director of Education and Standards for the General Medical Council. Then on the 16th of November, we will be exploring evidence relating to haemovigilance and pharmacovigilance through hearing from Professor James Newberger, Chair of SABTO, the Advisory Committee on the Safety of Blood, Tissues and Organs, Professor Mark Bellamy, Chair of SHOT, the Serious Hazards of Transfusion Steering Group, and from Dr. Alison Cave, Chief Safety Officer for the MHRA. On the 17th of November, we will be exploring issues relating to the extent to which there is still undiagnosed hepatitis C and how to address that. And we will be hearing from Professor Graham Foster, the National Clinical Lead for Hepatitis C for NHS England, Professor John Dillon, Professor of Hepatology on behalf of the Scottish Health Boards, Dr. Brendan Healy, the Blood-borne Virus Clinical Lead for Wales, and Dr Joanne McLean, Director of Public Health in the Public Health Agency Northern Ireland. That will be in the morning. In the afternoon, we will be hearing from Dr Michael Mulholland, Honorary Secretary of the Royal College of General Practitioners, and that will be to explore issues relating to GP knowledge and training in relation to hepatitis C. And then on the 18th of November, the Friday, we will be hearing from Professor Jonathan Van Tam, relatively recently Deputy Chief Medical Officer and recipient of the Royal Society David Attenborough Award for Outstanding Public Engagement with Science. And we aim to explore a range of issues with Professor Van Tam. So those are the witnesses currently scheduled. It may be that there will be an additional witness or witnesses added into the timetable. And so participants should keep an eye on the published timetable on the website.
And participants will be aware that the main focus of the exception perhaps being the statistics group is on the future.
Yes.
That is on the recommendations and what it might be in due course suggested I should recommend, which will lead to improvement in the future and make a difference.
Precisely.
Thank you. Thank you all.